very good evening to you and welcome to this evening's episode of The Watchdog. The COVID-19 pandemic and the recent looting spree have exposed the vulnerability of the country's public service. In a statement published this morning, the Public Service Commission, a constitutional body tasked with investigating, monitoring and evaluating both the capacity and the performance of the state, says there's a lack of capacity in critical areas of the public service. They have also seen leadership lapses at crucial times. Well, PSC Commissioner Dr. Somadoda Figeni is on standby to take us through their assessment and the implications it has for the country. After that interview, our panel will look for the day, will look at the peace deal announced a few hours ago to end weeks of deadly taxi wars that led to more than 20 deaths and massive destruction of property in the Western Cape. Among our panelists is a man who advised the Transport Minister and helped put together the deal. We'll also find out why DA leader John Steenhuisen didn't have a particularly great weekend after speaking to us on the show on Friday. The Watchdog starts now. A capable state would require, among others, a demonstration of strong leadership as well as strong and coherent institutions in a time of crisis. Well, so say Dr. Somadoda Figeni and his colleagues at the Public Service Commission. They say the incapacity of the state to communicate and create one source of truth, something that we saw over the past couple of weeks, is indicative of a state which lacks the capacity to respond appropriately in a time of crisis. Dr. Somadoda Figeni joins us now for this discussion. Good evening, Dr. Figeni. Thank you very much for your time. Perhaps very briefly, just by way of background, how did you get to a point of issuing the statement that you issued? Is it something you do regularly, or you felt that the events of the past few weeks required you to actually look at the public service and thereafter issue the statement that you issued?
Well, the Public Service Commission, as fulfillment of its constitutional mandate, which is indicated in Chapter 10, it does issue reports from time to time, but this time around we felt that we needed to address this situation because we faced two unprecedented disasters, COVID-19, as well as the looting and violence, which led to the unfortunate death of people and destruction of the livelihood of people. So that in itself, since 1994, was on an unprecedented scale. It therefore raised the question, is the state, is the public sector or public service able to respond to disasters of this nature? We've seen before the issue of drought, again, the lack of coordination and the contestation around that. We've seen the taxi violence. We've seen the gang violence in various townships like Mitchell's Plain, Cape Flats, El Dorado Park and so forth. And now we then experience these. Some of these have been there in a low intensity fashion. So we felt that it is very important to address the issue of the state capacity because we are constitutionally mandated to make sure that the state is effective, efficient, and also uphold the values of the Constitution.
What from the management of the COVID-19 pandemic specifically troubles you? What are the sort of things that you've seen, heard, that got you worried?
The first one, when you see the cabinet members and the security cluster speaking in turns with no coordination, contradicting each other, to the world out there, it's an invitation to say the state is vulnerable and weak. It is for that reason that within that particular space, you start having cyber attacks and many other things. And that in itself, we always knew that there were challenges, just like the porousness of our borders, just like many other weaknesses in the institution itself. So that was the first thing that we noticed. The second one, when you have people working from home, some taking turns, you find that people literally stopped providing services. You get in some reports phone calls that ring, even if you call it at 5 a.m., it says we are busy. This is the busiest hour, please hold on. And the music plays forever. So it means the contingency plans of how we move into this remote working has not been catered for. There are several other things, even the applications where people say, bring a copy physically to the offices in Pretoria and also mail it through the post office in your area. I mean, in the era of fourth industrial revolution, e-governance ought to kick in. So those are some of the weaknesses which stood out quite prominently. And never mind that there have been many other reports where we issued statements such as public servants issuing 350 rands to themselves whilst they're employed. And some of the monies for the unemployed being dispersed and the PPE scandals and so forth, all those are an indication of a very weakened institutional base of the state. And that in itself is at the heart of things that we should prioritize.
Whose responsibility is it to see to it that, all departments and organs of the state function optimally? In other words, who takes a bird's eye view, and then when they see the kinds of problems you're talking about, they are then able to move in and correct the wrongs? Whose responsibility is that?
Well, it starts with the leadership at the top, from the president to the cabinet ministers in their various portfolios, working with the DGs. Of course, it takes the Public Service Commission monitoring those processes and also advising to say this system is not working. It takes, the working together with the Department of Public Service and Administration, as well as the National School of Government, in the work that is being crafted of professionalization of the public service, so that we never come back to these particular problems. Performance management, consequence management, and many other things of appointing people based on merit, not patronage. Because patronage tend to elevate loyalty rather than capacity.
Now, this is the same department, Public Service and Administration, that was tasked with the whole process of reorganizing the state. One would imagine that process would take into account, or in fact be alive to the problems that you've just outlined, and hopefully by now would have come to certain conclusions about what needs to be done. Any idea how far that process is?
There is a draft document on the framework on professionalization of public service. Of course, the most recent events ought to be a reminder on some of the very urgent issues in terms of trying to build the state capacity on how we respond to disasters, because we've entered in the world an era of volatility, ambiguity, complexity that is going to be unstable for some time. So leaders and public institutions will have to adapt into those spaces and be effective and innovative. So that in itself, I think, to me, is key, that the public participate, make the input in those. In the final analysis, it is active citizenry that has a sense of agency to say, we are the leaders we've been waiting for, and we will hold leaders to account. You saw when communities stood up, working with the police, how effective that was. It was more than what police and soldiers could do on their own.
Mm-hmm. Now, linked to that, to the whole reorganization which the president promised, was the issue of accountability. We are told that he enters into agreements, performance agreements, with his ministers, and we expect the same to happen with regards to DGs, DDGs, chief directors, all the way to the lowest paid person in all the state agencies and departments. Do you, as the Public Service Commission, know whether the performance of members of the executive and of public servants actually happens? Does that actually happen, or does it exist in paper only, from where you see it?
Well, it does exist, but at a close range. I'm sure the presidency and the Department of Planning and Monitoring will actually be more accurate in responding with specifics. But what is most important, though, which we have observed over time, there are problems which are brought to the Public Service Commission on the very understanding of performance management system and consequence management. And in our observation over the years, it is a consequence of the gradual progressive deconstruction of institutions and weakening of them into patronage networks where there is no merit. People come in because there are networks. Once you have that patrimonial system, you are unlikely going to have consequence management. You are unlikely going to hold people accountable. And that in itself, I would imagine, afflicts different levels. And in some instances, some people use the same tools to punish their opponents and to reward their friends with no objective facts presented. So those are some of the cases, but we're analyzing the pattern and the system to advise. The other challenge with the Public Service Commission as it stands now as a Chapter 10 institution is that we advise Parliament, we advise government, but it might just be in the reforms a good thing to explore whether something more forceful than just advisory role is needed so that you have that transparency. You do have a very technical system to prove that a person performed or did not perform, or a person had done something wrong. Consequence management has happened.
You're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that perhaps the Public Service Commission needs more teeth than is currently the case.
Certainly, without any doubt, that has been raised in some of the documents. Look at how the Auditor General was becoming a lamentation forum to say, after effect, this has happened, that has happened. Once reformed, it could go report the cases with the police, it could go report certain things on the spot. And that empowered the Auditor General's office, because it was no longer just a document that comes after effect, more like an obituary arrangement. So this in itself, I think, is very important for such an important institution, that the framers of our constitutional democracy felt that there should be a dedicated Chapter 10 that talks about public service, and that in Section 196 creates the Public Service Commission as the one responsible for those. If you give it teeth, more so now that the president and government has made the issue of building state capacity a number one priority, because everything else we can hope for, if you don't have that capacity, you'll always have corruption, you'll always have service delivery, you'll always have policies that are promised, never implemented, and you'll always have a patronage system, and you override all the policies, no matter how good they are.
Any thoughts on the kinds of teeth, if we call them that, that could be given to the commission for it to...
Well, I do think that whilst this is still being deliberated within the PSC itself, but making sure that once there are findings, they are binding, and no one can then second guess without legitimate reasons. And if you want to challenge them, you simply review them in court. Just like the public protector and other institutions, you do just that.
Now, I mean, everyone knows that when this particular administration started after the 2019 elections, there was a lot of tough talking, problems were outlined, and there was a commitment to actually deal with these problems. From where you sit as the Public Service Commission, is there evidence that the tough talking has actually been followed by action?
Well, I do think that when you put issues on the balance of scale, it's mixed results. You see that institutions such as the NPA has been, rebuilding. You see some of the institutions which are there. You see commissions which are taking place, and you see efforts to build some. But in some instances, as one would expect, there is fierce resistance because some people have never lived outside the patronage system. To them, when you say, let's work on merit, to them, when you say, let's create spaces for the youth, they cannot even understand the grammar of what you are trying to say, because many people have always done things in a particular way. So when you have institutional culture embedded in the public service, it's not a proclamation, but it is a continuous struggle and a process. And that struggle needs a broad front and partnership from ordinary civil service, civil society, to government, to business, to different sectors, and the citizenry. Then you'll begin to see the promises of the dream of our democracy. But the moment we say we leave it to the cabinet, we leave it to the DG, we leave it to the police, but we won't say anything, we won't play any role in our communities, that's when things fall apart.
What then does civil society do? I mean, earlier you were saying that we're pointing out to at what happened a few weeks ago and how communities managed to achieve what no South African police service or army could do. How does civil society begin to now agitate for the changes that you're talking about that are not in the interests of building the kind of public service we want or deserve as a country?
Well, I do think that we have historical references to this effect, because in the 50s, right at the height of apartheid regime, when it was the strongest at the moment, people mobilized on a mass scale, different political parties, civil society organizations, trade unions, women's organizations, and so forth. Then you had a mass defiance campaign, which was able to challenge that regime. And that mass defiance campaign led into that blueprint, the Freedom Charter. And that in itself also led to the march of women into the union building, because they were conscientized, they were agitated to say, yes, leaders can play their role, but for them to be effective and be held accountable, whether political leaders or public servants, the ordinary people must insist. For example, if people say, we want certain things in our languages, they must insist, we want to participate before you come and build a school, social facilitation, we want it to be like this, like that, like that. The same thing happened in the 70s with Black Consciousness Movement. Conscientized people, they had self-reliance. In the 80s, mass democratic movement, again, churches, sports groups, NGOs, everybody was involved. Things always start getting south when you lead your destiny, you leave your destiny in the hands of a few political or business elite. That's why we have one of the most unequal societies, because the elite start seeing this as, all you can eat buffet for themselves. Then you begin to see those things. Patronage system come in. Entry levels for new businesses are difficult. Employment is difficult and so forth. So to break that, you cannot rely entirely on the leadership without the assistance of a social movement of people for positive action. And that in itself would hold accountable public servants, political leaders, political parties, because very often right now dependency and a sense of helplessness where people say, we are waiting for this leader, we are looking for a messiah, whether a messiah in a church or faith group or a messiah in a political organization, people look helpless in many instances. So this new amber of light where people came in, they make an association that the things have been going down, and if we don't intervene, we end up paying more tax, we end up losing more jobs, we end up paying more fuel and so forth. So they are seeing that government does not have money, it's your money, but you must follow it and be a watchdog whenever it is being used.
That's where we're going to leave this evening. Thank you very much to Dr. Figeni for coming through. He is, of course, a commissioner with the Public Service Commission. Today, they issued a statement talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent looting spree have actually exposed the vulnerability of the country's public service. After the break, we examine the peace deal announced a few hours ago to end weeks of deadly taxi wars that led to more than 20 deaths and massive destruction of property in the Western Cape. Don't go away.
More news and updates as we take a look at the week ahead. Ayanda, good afternoon. What are some of these sentiments being echoed?
They will not allow former President Jacob Zuma to imprison.
What needs to be factored in?
If it does not go to the Zondo Commission, then the Crown Court will then say you then have to go to jail.
The impact that COVID-19 has had on the police ministry.
We've seen over 30,000 infections.
We'll continue to bring you more news and updates. I'm your host, Lisa Wilson.
Cabinet this afternoon decided that the country should be moved from adjusted alert level 4 and be placed on adjusted alert level 3. Gatherings will be allowed but will be limited to a maximum of 50 people indoors and 100 people outdoors. Non-essential establishments such as restaurants, taverns, bars and fitness centers may be opened. The sale of alcohol from retail outlets for off-site consumption will be permitted between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. from Monday to Thursday. Attendance at funerals and cremations may not exceed 50 people. Night vigils and after funeral gatherings are still not allowed. Interprovincial travel for leisure may resume once more. Hours of curfew starting at 10 p.m. and will end at 4 a.m.
Here we take a look at some of the big stories to come out of the week, what has been making headlines and, of course, getting South Africans talking. SAPRA has approved the CoronaVac vaccine.
So what we asked for is for lab data.
Now, we've also seen this week where hundreds of supporters of former President Jacob Zuma have defied government's lockdown regulations. The number of people crossing into South Africa illegally from Eswatini has increased in recent days.
We're not 100% sure how safe they are in Swaziland.
From our studios in Auckland Park, I'm your host, Lisa Wilson.
Amanda! Amanda! We are saying no to our infrastructures, no! No to looting! No! We are not going to destroy our own life here. This is black excellence, let's protect it! Down with looting, down! Down with looting, down!
We have seen in other countries in Zimbabwe what happened after they destroyed their own economy.
The plazas are looted, the other malls are looted, so we have a serious food security crisis.
We are saying we cannot live like this. As a community, we are tired because our siblings are going to lose jobs.
We promise our business owners and all the workers that we are going to be in town up until month end.
We are not fighting actually. We are saying enough is enough.
Welcome back. This is the Watchdog. A few hours ago, a deal was announced to end weeks of deadly taxi wars that led to more than 20 deaths and massive destruction of property in the Western Cape. Among our panelists is a man who advised the Transport Minister and helped put together that deal, and that is Mr. Lawrence Vengile. But also joining him is Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, who is the General Secretary of SAFTU, who was involved in earlier initiatives to try and broker this deal. We are also joined by Dr. Mateta Mokonyama, who is the HOD, Transport Systems and Operations at the Council of Science and Industrial Research. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Let me start with you, Mr. Vengile. How easy or difficult was it to finally, get these parties to make peace?
It was not an easy process because we had to navigate through a number of issues and interests. Remember, you have local associations that operate on the ground, but you also have mother bodies, and therefore navigating between those interests was important. But more importantly, I think on the part of government, we are not saying we've reached the end of the road. I think the work only begins now, because the more important issue is about the sustainability of whatever intervention is in place in the long term, because we need to address the underlying issues, some of which are historical, that relate to allocation of roads.
We will get into those in a short while. But what were the trickiest areas to navigate, Mr. Vengile?
The trickiest areas to navigate was to find the parties, was to assist the parties to find each other in relation to their interests. Remember, at the heart of this conflict, like any other conflict relating to routes, are the economic interests. Who can operate what route? But also you needed to look at the issues, the law. What are the issues that are permitted in law? That is why we then separated issues and say, let's eat this elephant in piecemeal, because some of the issues may not have been resolved today, but there are processes that must continue to unfold. But the most important issue out of this agreement is a firm commitment that the law will bite, and anybody from today's agreement who is found to have been party to instigating violence further, the law will not hesitate to deal with him. But that also includes holding associations accountable for the conduct of their members and the members, which may even include them losing their operating licenses and therefore the ability to conduct business. So those issues are quite important in terms of ensuring that we are able to sustain what we agree on, both in terms of ensuring the safety of the users of the system as well as the public, but also accountability. You cannot have an industry that operates with impunity and there are no consequences for that kind of conduct. That was at the heart of the agreement today, and both parties, including Santaco, have committed themselves that they will respect the rule of the law, but also we will ensure that the other elements of criminality the police must come to the party, and investigate, because we want to see the criminals arrested and the law taking its course. Because you cannot allow a situation where innocent people, their lives are at stake because of people who do not want to agree to each other. So it was a milestone that we've been able to reach this step, but there's still a long way to go.
Mr. Vavi, I mean, you were brought in as outsiders to try, and get the warring parties, to find one another. What did you learn as an outsider looking in? What struck you during the time that you were involved in in trying to broker a deal between these taxi organizations?
Well, quite a number, Vuyo. The first and the biggest to ourselves was that the taxi industry was left unregulated by the apartheid regime, and that the efforts to regulate it in the first 26, 27 years of democracy have not yielded any result. So that's a big problem. So it's a deregulated, unregulated industry, which the only way to regulate it is through issuing of the licenses. That's the first point. The second biggest point is the disunity amongst the taxi associations. The Western Cape issue is even more complicated because the history of the divisions is that before democracy, you had two associations at loggerheads with one another. If you remember, we had Webster, we have Lagunya. They merged to form Codeta. So for some reason, 3 years ago, a group left Codeta to form Kata, and a significant group from Kata moved back to Codeta. And all that created tensions and ill feelings. And that's why, for example, colleagues from Kata were arguing that those that have left it must leave their licenses behind. And we needed to get the department to clarify as to whether the license is issued to an association or to the individual who is applying for the license. The third issue, which is big for the industry, is at the back of that deregulation and failure to regulate it, is that they can see across the river that the private bus companies are being subsidized heavily by government. The private trains in Gauteng, in particular Gautrain, government is pouring billions of rands in it to ensure that the upper middle class can move from the airport to the Sandton City. There is no cent that goes to the taxi industry. So there is anger that have been boiling that even when there was a COVID, they were asked to operate at 7 a person for some time during the level 5 regulations. And all of that money promised didn't see their way into the pockets. And as a result, the taxi operators lost their taxis. They were being dispossessed. So there is the competition that Mr. Vengile is talking about, the economic interest, are so intense such that a small matter, if you do not manage well, in particular in the context of different associations, can ignite fire and create all of the havoc that we have seen.
So there are deep-seated issues that are sparked by, little things, and then they get out of control. Mr. Vavi?
Are you coming back to me?
Yes. I'm saying, so you're saying what we're seeing here is that small things, that trigger these fights, but the reality is that there are deep-seated issues that have been there for a very long time, and yeah.
Including just planning issues, for example. One issue that we agreed with them in the agreement, we reached with them in the agreement in inverted commas, because there's a development of the same principles that were signed by the parties today. The issue of a planning government, a government that knows how to manage the growth of the economy and the decline of the economy. A government that knows that there will be a shopping complex, a mall in Area A, and that complex is going to employ approximately 1,000 or 2,000, and where is the transport arrangement or plan for those people? A government that will know that in point C, we're developing a residential area and of how many people, where these people are going to be working, where is the growth in terms of any manufacturing, the service industries in the economy, and where is the decline? For example, Western Cape have seen massive decline of its clothing textile industry. Surely you have to have a government that will anticipate that the decline in particular industrial areas will lead to tensions if those taxi associations do not find space elsewhere. And that's a big factor, that have led to the conflicts that we have seen in the Western Cape.
Dr. Mokonyama, you guys have been studying these patterns, What is your take? What is responsible for these flare-ups of these taxi wars?
I think the whole ecosystem of safety and security in public transport has deteriorated, quite rapidly. In around 2001, at the CSIR, we wrote a book called, Crime and Crime Prevention on public transport, and that was essentially victim, survey, getting to understand, how things, happen on the trains, at terminals and so forth. And we got to understand, we published that report. And what we have seen with recent surveys that we've carried out, household, surveys, we find that, the increase is quite notable, where household members say, we feel very unsafe, when waiting for a taxi. We feel very unsafe when waiting for a bus service. While inside a train, we feel very unsafe. So it's the entire ecosystem of safety and security. So what that signals is that we have not, or the state essentially has not, put resources where its mouth is with regard to, safety and security. So essentially, the message is we don't care. Mr. Vavi there made a very good point. If you look at a service like Gautrain, the team, the project team that is responsible for managing just the project itself, a project team, there's about 100 people funded to the tune, I think, of about 1.5 or so billion, per annum, just to manage the contract. And you look at an agreement that we reach, in the taxi industry, or some work that we initiative. Taxi industry transports, to the tune of 5 billion, right? 5 billion passengers per annum. Our train, we're talking about at best about 12 million. So 5 billion versus about 12 million, thereabout. In fact, now you're talking probably 3 million. So you look at the resource allocation in terms of dealing with service quality, monitoring, evaluation, improvements, and so forth, you begin to see where our priorities lie. So essentially, we need to say we care as government, and therefore we are going to provide these resources, in response.
What, in your view, is missing? In other words, because you do have a government, you do have transport. Mr. Vengile is an advisor to the Minister of Transport, who I would imagine, know most of the things that you and Mr. Vavi are talking about. Where do you think lies the problem?
Well, who takes government to task, to jail, if it breaks laws? there are laws, there are regulations that say the role of local government will be to plan, to estimate, what it needs in the next whatever number of years, and then invite interested parties to be able to participate in providing services like transport. Now, if you fail to do those things, it's a constitutional duty. So who takes government to task when it fails? For the taxi industry, it's easy to say, we are going to take you to task. We're going to assign police on you. But when the government breaks the rules, its own rules, who takes government to court? So it's about accountability. Having accountability in local government, doing exactly what you need to do, because it's clear what needs to be done. I think Mr. Vavi touched on it. In fact, we were working with a number of students to show how you can begin to forecast, the capacity, the network capacity that you need, how many vehicles you will need, by when. So it's not a very complicated exercise, but you need to put resources into that. So if you fail to do so, the consequence is that you create a vacuum, and then other things happen because of that vacuum.
Mr. Vengile, can you help us here starting with the last point that Dr. Mkonyama was talking about? Who is responsible for the planning, for planning our public transport needs?
Thanks, Vuyo. The public transport is a concurrent function among the spheres of government. Now, municipalities have a responsibility in terms of the law to develop integrated transport plans, which integrated plans must then also make a determination in terms of the demand and supply. It is also part of the reason that when the minister got involved in the process is that we cannot be pointing fingers, but let's work together. One of the things in the agreement today is that with immediate effect, we're declaring the planning authority, which is the municipalities of Drakenstein and the city of Cape Town, a moratorium on new operating licenses. What has been happening, Vuyo, has been that either because the cities either do not have the capacity or the requisite support to build that capacity, when the regulatory entity in the province that issues the operating licenses adjudicates an application, they are required by law to refer it to that planning authority, being the municipality. More often than not, the municipalities simply don't respond because the plans are either accumulating dust or the surveys have not been done in a long time. The three spheres of government, in fact, the law enjoins the three spheres of government, both the province and national. If municipalities do not have the capacity, they must come to the party and assist in building that capacity. This is one of the areas where we're saying the user must be at the center, and therefore the planning authority and the capacity of municipalities to plan must be a joint responsibility. That is why even when we emerge out of the National Taxi Lekgotla, we're saying we're not going to reinvent the wheel and have another talk shop. We need to take to logical conclusion the processes that the former ministers have initiated. One of those things is the subsidy policy that Mr. Vavi referred to. The reality is that the 2020 household travel survey demonstrates that the market share of the taxi industry has even gone up higher than what it was in 2013. It's now it's more than 60%. It's now hovering above 70%. What that tells us is exactly the point that the resources, who are you subsidized? The resources must go towards assisting the end user, because the reality is that workers use public transport. The purpose of the subsidy is to make that public transport affordable. And it is for that reason that we had said we are now currently engaging with the leadership of the industry at national level on the subsidy policy, because it should not just be a talk shop, but part of the critical trade-offs that we have to make is also the structure of the industry, because the very purpose of formalizing the taxi industry is to make sure that we bring this industry in from the fringes of the economy. into the mainstream economy. And therefore part of that is that the resources and the money, in fact, when we talk about resources, we're talking about there's a lot of money that government spends, one, on subsidies, two, you have your tax recap, where we've spent billions. And what we're saying is that we need to consolidate all of those into a public transport fund. And when we talk about the subsidy, because we have to answer the question, who are you subsidizing? The intention is that we have to subsidize the end user that uses the public transport. If the end user, the mode of choice is the taxi industry, that must be reflected in terms of how the money flows in relation. But again, we have not in a long time turned on its head the subsidy system that we inherited from the apartheid. Because remember now,
why
the subsidy
though?
System as it exists.
Why have we not done that?
I think part of the challenge over the years, which we intend to zoom in on, has been that the three spheres of government have been operating in silos. And that is why we're saying you cannot say if the municipality has no planning capacity, you'll fold your arms until one day they have the capacity when you are enjoined by law to provide that support. That is one of the things that's at the heart now of the model that we have in place. But the other issue as well is also the regulation. After the new administration came in 1994, moved to regulate the industry, which had been deregulated by the apartheid state, as Mr. Vavier had pointed out. But the pace of implementing that regulation has been painstakingly slow. And part of the...
And who takes responsibility for that? Who takes responsibility for the slow pace?
Oh, government indeed. Government has to take responsibility for the pace, because it is firmly within the ambit of government. Because whether you're talking about operating licenses as the primary instrument which you permit, but I realized that there is a symbiotic relationship between regulating the industry, by extension addressing the issues of unity and leadership, as well as the economic interest that you need to build. We're talking about an industry that generates in excess of 50 billion into the economy. But who benefits from that? In the same thing as a tax recap. It is for that reason that Minister Mbalula had said at the Taxi Lekgotla, I do not want another talk shop. Let us fix what is broken and let us build on what is. There's a lot of work that CSIR has done to guide the efforts that government is implementing. But part of the problem is the fragmentation which we want to bring to an end. That Gauteng as a province must not do its own thing and behave like it's a separate country. We all have a responsibility, but the coordination of all of that is the responsibility of the Minister of Transport in terms of the law. Mm-hmm. And that is why the minister has been quite emphatic that he will work with all spheres of government to make sure that we address all these ills and not wait for another 5 years and another administration.
Okay. Quick last word from you, Mr. Vavier, about what needs to be done.
Well, I felt that I must just make a comment in passing about the legacy and the legacy of promises, of changing ministers, and of making commitments, and of talk shops, of conferences and lekgotlas. All of those have not produced any results worth celebrating. Okay. In fact, personally, I blame this dilly-dallying on the government. For the government should have anticipated that this is what we're dealing with. The government have destroyed the public transport system in the Western Cape. One of the consequences of the fact that there's no trains running between Paarl and Cape Town is that suddenly there's an influx of commuters standing in the streets and left stranded, not able to go to work in time. here in Gauteng, in Johannesburg, the entire rail system's infrastructure have been collapsed because government will not make sure that it protects what is absolutely critical in the lives of workers. And it goes to the point that we're raising. We cannot take out the race question and the class question here.
Okay.
The people who are using the taxis are black and they are working class. Perhaps that's why the government is dragging its foot in subsidizing them, but works with lightning speed to subsidize Gauteng and to subsidize the planes and everything else that is being used by everybody else. And that change of mentality, Vuyo, is going to be absolutely central if we are to avoid further violence in the industry.
Quick last word from you, Mr. Mokonyama.
Yeah, we spent, we forecast that we are going to be spending, to the tune of 500 billion on the road accident fund. A massive deficit, let me say, a deficit of about 5 in the next 2 years or so. That is a lot of money. Road crashes, for example, cost the economy about 3.5% of equivalent of the GDP. We estimated that a few years ago. Probably now it's a bit more. But we fund public transport to the tune of 0.8%. We estimated 0.8% equivalent of GDP. So we're saying we need to increase that to as much as 5%. Because the backlog actually is to the tune of 5% equivalent of GDP. Mm-hmm. So we need to increase funding of public transport to the tune of about 5% of GDP. Now that is going to be invested in the infrastructure and services. The underfunding of public transport in general is part of the reason why the backlog will never be arrested. So we need to be decisive in that. There are lots of inefficiencies in the system. Like I said, road accident fund, lots of money being spent there. Okay. We can do with a lot of that money in the system.
That's where we're going to leave it. Thanks to our guests, Dr. Mateta Mokonyana, Lawrence Venkile, and Zwelinzima Vavi. Now, on Friday, we invited the leader of the Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, to the program about a proposal that he has put to the president, asking him to meet leaders of opposition parties. Well, at the end of that interview, this is the question that I asked him.
Obviously, we'll have to consider it and to see what the terms were. I mean, I've said very, very often that, we want to be part of the solution in South Africa and that we're the president's partners in the rational centre around, fixing South Africa. I think that there's many instances where we agree with what the president's trying to do, the fact that he's being held back by people in his own party, but we'd have to look at what the terms are of that. If it meant that we, would have to give up, independence, etc., we would have to examine that. But my party and I stand very, very ready to get our hands dirty and to offer our expertise and experience in helping to rebuild South Africa.
Part of Mr. Steenhuisen's answer to my question, which was what would he do if the president was to give him a portfolio, and he gave that answer. Well, over the weekend, he wasn't very happy when our news programs ran a couple of sound bites from that answer, and today, this is what he had to say.
I've never once said I would serve in the president's cabinet. I would find it very difficult to serve in a cabinet with some of the people that the president has around the table. But I did say that the DA stands ready to be a partner with government to rebuild, to grow, and to ensure that we get South Africa onto a new trajectory. We've done it already in Parliament with the public protector vote. We've said very clearly, where the president and his team put on the table reforms that are going to help us grow the economy, get people working again, and create businesses and jobs and fight corruption, we will be their best partner.
Well, so we're going to leave it this evening. To join us again tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. Have a good night.
The Agas House, downtown Johannesburg.